When we counted down Electronic Gaming Monthly's top 10 Phantasy Star games earlier this week, you probably thought that was it. The critics have spoken, and now we can move on from Sega's futuristic role-playing franchise. But not so fast, because there's another part of Phantasy Star's past that I think we need to talk about. It's a dark, twisted tale of how Sega committed the ultimate video game sin. Okay, it's not that bad, but that's definitely how the media treated it at the time. This is the story of how a simple strategy guide ruined Phantasy Star. What is the worst thing a role-playing developer can possibly do? Is it when a beloved franchise spends the better part of 15 years transforming their turn-based RPG into an action game? Or maybe it's when you end a beloved trilogy in the absolute worst way possible. Believe it or not, the answer is none of the above. Because the worst thing a role-playing developer can do is add a strategy guide for no additional cost? Wait, hang on. That can't possibly be right. I know it sounds crazy, but there was a time when a small strategy guide was at the center of a big controversy. In fact, I would argue that this very strategy guide that you're looking at right now is the first media-conceived scandal of the 1990s, causing pretty much everybody to look real bad. The first thing you need to know is that gaming tastes were a lot different 3 decades ago. If you were a console gamer in the early 1990s, then you probably liked side-scrolling platformers, shoot-em-ups, and other straightforward genres. While Nintendo Entertainment System owners may have dabbled with Final Fantasy, Dragon Warrior, and a smattering of other role-playing games, the genre was still very small and incredibly niche. Sega had already discovered this when they released the original Phantasy Star on the 8-bit Master System, a game that cost a lot of money to make and underperformed at retail. You have to remember that this was a time when critics would open up their review by reminding the readers that they don't like role-playing games. Even when Electronic Gaming Monthly reviewed a role-playing classic, at least 2 of the critics would always complain about how they hate the slow pace, or the wordy dialogue, or the turn-based combat. There was an expectation that console games should be fast and exciting, and old-school role-playing games were the very antithesis of that. I bring all this up to highlight that Sega had an uphill battle when it came to trying to sell American gamers on Phantasy Star 2, the first big role-playing game on the 16-bit Genesis. Not only were a lot of the critics already against the genre by default, but the high cost of production and localization meant that the game would retail for around 25% more than a standard 2D platformer. Knowing that they had to actively persuade gamers to even give this type of adventure game a chance, Sega made a bold decision. They were going to package a small but insanely useful strategy guide with copies of Phantasy Star 2. This enraged the gaming press. Electronic Gaming Monthly literally said that it ruined the game. Gossip guru Quarterman was so upset at the ordeal that he begged Sega not to punish Genesis owners anymore. Don't, I'm begging you, don't put Phantasy Star 3 players through the same thing. Month after month, the editors of EGM would rail against Sega for offering such an evil extra with their product. Why can't Sega release the book a couple of months after the cart hits the stores, the Q-Man questions. You don't have huge toll-free numbers to fund anymore, and besides, you could even collect some spare change from gamers who feel the urge to cheat. Still feeling like he wasn't being dramatic enough, Quarterman concluded that ruining Phantasy Star 2 was bad enough. But now must Sword of Vermilion endure the same punishment? Oh yes, the punishment of a company deciding to offer a strategy guide as a free incentive to buy their expensive adventure game. Oh, the horror! How could any company get away with doing something so evil? Alright, yeah, that's a lot of sarcasm. But I kind of feel like Quarterman earned that by whining for month after month about this damn strategy guide. Especially since it actually made a ton of sense for Sega, a company that was trying anything it could think of to incentivize American gamers to take a chance on a genre they normally aren't interested in. When Nintendo did the same thing with their Phantasy Star strategy guide, it turned that game into a hit. Why wouldn't Sega want to duplicate that success? But that reasoning wasn't good enough for games journalists in the early 1990s. Instead of simply pointing out that veteran gamers should ignore Sega's strategy guide, they actually used the book as a reason to give the games lower scores. Here's Mike from EGM's Sega-themed spin-off magazine Megaplay saying just that. Sorry, Sega. This great RPG could have been rated higher if you wouldn't have again included the damn walkthrough book. And Mike wasn't alone, as here is Bart saying the exact same thing. What's Sega gonna do next? Include a private tutor with Phantasy Star 3? A nice role-playing game that unfortunately is spoiled by a free cheat book. All 4 of the Megaplay critics made mention of the hint book and lowered their scores because of it. Look, while I pick on Megaplay, the practice of lowering the scores ran rampant across all of the Sendai publishing magazines. Editorials were written about it, Quarterman was brought in, and gamers were bombarded with reasons not to invest their money in Phantasy Star 2, one of the very best 16-bit role-playing games. And believe it or not, it's all because Sega tried to give gamers an incentive to buy their expensive adventure game. Now, just for argument's sake, let's go ahead and play devil's advocate for just a moment and try to see things from EGM and Megaplay's point of view. I would agree with them that the fun of most role-playing games is the adventuring and the sense of discovery. It's the feeling that you get when you're off finding new areas and discovering all the secrets that make this fantasy world so compelling. If you rely on a strategy guide or look ahead, honestly, I could see how some of the magic of the RPG experience might be dulled a little bit. After all, learning from a hint book that Aerith dies halfway through Final Fantasy VII would probably rob that moment of any of its emotional impact. It's honestly better to uncover the big and small moments on your own, without a guide. There's just one problem with this argument. Nobody was forcing you to read the damn guide. You could easily throw it away or even light it on fire if you don't want it. The choice was up to you. The guide didn't even spoil important plot points, as it was simply designed to help new players understand the basics of a role-playing game, along with some important information on weapons and items and enemies. The fact that this completely optional guide was enough to impact review scores is absolute madness. And if nothing else, it's a stark reminder that petty video game controversies are nothing new. In the end, Electronic Gaming Monthly and Megaplay got their way. After the release of Sword of Vermilion, Sega decided to stop publishing these pack-in strategy guides, forcing gamers who got stuck in Phantasy Star 3 and 4 to call a special 1-900 number or even fork over $15 for a hint book. Instead of fighting for the consumer, this was an example of Quarterman and the review crew hoping that regular gamers would have to pay more for the answers that they needed. And even though this happened more than 30 years ago and is ancient history, I still think that it sucks. Hey, thanks for indulging me as I talk about these classic reviews and some of the darker moments of games journalism. This may just be a silly story, but I think it's worth telling. It just goes to show that some things from 30 years ago are very different, yet other things are exactly the same. Look for more of these story-based episodes in the future. Now, here's the question I have for you. Did you ever buy or use a guidebook? I'm talking about strategy guides, which used to be big business back in the day. These days, YouTube has largely taken over that space. But hey, you can still get a guide for a lot of the bigger games. Let me see your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with a recap episode of the Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew. That is, assuming Nintendo doesn't surprise announce something new. I'm guessing that this is going to be an off week, so look for something fun on Friday. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.